All right. Hey, everyone. Gabe Kapler here, and I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Gabe Kapler, and I'm the manager of the San Francisco Giants. And I'm excited to have this discussion with both Billy and Roscoe, and more than anything, just hear stories and exchange ideas. So from here, I can kick it to Roscoe.
Thanks, Cap. I guess I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm Roscoe Mapps. My preferred pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs with the San Francisco Giants. I'm also the co-chair for our DEI Council and our Black Business Employee Resource Group. This is my sixth season with the Giants, and I'm excited to join you today.
My name is Billy Bean. I'm humbled to be invited to be a part of this conversation with Gabe and Roscoe. I currently am Vice President and Special Assistant to the Commissioner of Major League Baseball. I played 6 years in the major leagues. I've held my current position at MLB for the past 8 years, and I oversee a lot of off-field development education initiatives, as well as a bridge to the mental health and wellness resources for our players.
Awesome. I'd actually love to just kick it off with you specifically, Billy, since you mentioned those 6 years in Major League Baseball. Just kind of hear from the beginning how you came out, what some of the challenges were in sharing that information with the baseball world, but also anything else you'd like to share on that topic.
So my rookie year in the major leagues was 1987. So I played in a different era than the one that exists now. And I grew up, how I grew up had a huge impact on that process. I'm the oldest of 5 boys. My dad was in the Marine Corps, and then he became a uniformed law enforcement officer for the next 25 years. He's from the Midwest, and we were raised very Catholic. And so where I grew up, because of my dad's military background, his friends were African-American, Hispanic, all military brothers, and treated each other that way, very close. And so I wasn't subjected to an environment that was racist, but that community of men in that time were very homophobic. And so those comments, not directed at anybody in particular, but just out there, those stereotypes were the only kind of reference I had to gay or lesbian. There was no LGBTQ conversation of any kind at that time in the 70s when I was a little kid. And one of the things that is the great irony of, I think, my personal journey is that I was very good at sports. I was a quarterback of the high school football team. I played on the basketball team. I got drafted 2 or 3 times. I was in the big leagues at 22. And so being good at sports, not only did I never meet anybody that told me that they were gay, I never saw an image or a reference anywhere in the media or in literature that told me that there might be someone like me in my community, which was usually a baseball game of some kind. And so it really, I think, hindered my process. I got married to my college girlfriend. I spent 8 years of my life and half of my baseball career married. And it wasn't until I was a little older that I started traveling around to bigger cities. And I think somehow references started to help my process, and I started to fear that I might be gay, and there was nobody to talk to about it. And it was a whole different time. For the people watching this, it might seem impossible to think about life without the internet, but that was my existence. And in those days, you had to talk to somebody about something like that. And that was a deadly secret when you're playing high school football, or you're in the minor leagues, or you're trying to make a big league. I was a marginal big league player, and every single clubhouse I ever walked into, I just wanted the respect of those fellow teammates in hopes that I belonged there and that I would stay there and that I wouldn't get sent back to AAA. And so there was never a time that I ever even considered telling anybody. It took me a long time. I left a marriage that was a devastating divorce, with both families not wanting it to happen, after I met somebody. And I waited for that relationship until I got out of my marriage, which it's a miracle to me that the last 3 years of my big league career, I even was able to show up at the park, because I was juggling a double life, secrets, lying to everybody. And then, ironically, I started, once I found my partner, I met someone, his name was Sam, and we lived together in San Diego, my 3 years there. And I literally hid him like a secret. It was impossibly difficult, but I started to gain some footing at the big league level and learn how to contribute and know my place as a backup outfielder and a pinch hitter, defensive replacement. And I felt like I was somehow balancing it for a while. And then in 1994, during the lockout, my partner, Sam, was becoming very ill, and he was diagnosed with HIV. And it was just a blow that I was not prepared for. I thought I was in a safe relationship because I was monogamous, and it's possible that he had HIV for over a decade and didn't know it. And then it was finally, and so the end of my career happened very, very quickly, Gabe. I was coming home. It was the night before my last year. I didn't know it would be that last year, but my partner, I found him passed out, unconscious in our home. I rushed him to the hospital, and he died of HIV-related causes the night before opening day. And we had one more game to play in that spring, and I walked out of the hospital at 7 a.m. With a bag of his clothes in my hand, and I drove to play the last spring training game at Angel Stadium in Anaheim from San Diego. And I didn't tell anybody what happened, and I just buried that experience. And somehow I kept it to myself until the end of that season. And then once I got out of the structure of having to be somewhere every single day that our teams have, I just walked away. Didn't give the Padres a reason, didn't tell my agent why. And I was out of baseball for a very, very long time. And I never thought that I would ever be a part of it, because gay and sports and those conversations in the middle 90s were still extremely rare. There was no role models for male team sports of any kind. We had Billie Jean King, Martina Navratilova, and my story, I never intended to tell it. I was away from my family for a couple of years. I moved to Miami Beach as far away as I could, got a dog with no plan B, and I just said I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I didn't realize how much I loved baseball and how much I missed it until I was out of it. And as you know, Gabe and Roscoe, baseball moves along very quickly without us, and it will continue with or without one person. And I never gave anybody in baseball a chance to be supportive of me or be there, And I had a couple great teammates, great friend. Brad Osmus was my roommate for the 3 years there, and him and his wife Liz have never really forgiven me for not confiding in them and just walking away. And it wasn't until 4 years after my last game, that I was opening up a restaurant of all things in Miami Beach. And a writer was a part of our community named Lydia Martin. And she found out about me and someone who I was seeing at the time, and just relentlessly went after me to write about it. And and kind of gave me a little history about why it would be so important. And I didn't think anybody would care because I wasn't an all-star player and I barely was there when I was there. And next thing I knew, I was on the front page of the New York Times in the Sunday edition in my uniform about a big leaguer comes out of hiding. And from there, when I started stopped lying about myself and living in shame, I started meeting people in my community. And that education process allowed me to be the person I am now and have the skill set to come back to baseball. And that was by their invitation, not mine. And for me, people that had to live in the closet or still do for whatever their reasons or their purpose or their truth, I have great sensitivity for them and empathy, because it is a place of darkness where you literally have to lie about almost every single thing that's going on in your life. And so it was long overdue. I wish that I could go back in time and make different decisions. But as we know, we can't. And it makes me more than determined than ever to be a voice for those that don't have one.
Thank you. I have several follow-up questions. How much of your living in secrecy and kind of lying about your life had to do with your family, and how much of it had to do with the sports world? Like, if the sports world was better at creating safer spaces, would this have still gone the same way? Or was your family a big enough influence where you'd still be probably dealing with a lot of the same issues?
That's a great question, because I thought my family, I went from the golden child, the oldest son, major league career, making money. I thought they would reject me. I really did. I could not the thought of telling my dad paralyzed me, because I didn't want him to look at me differently, or whatever stereotypes that I held on to about what the straight athlete thought about gay men was. I was blocked by that. And I do think that, and when you talk about safe spaces, I do think if I had had one conversation with Brad Osmus or Dave Hansen or Archie Cianfrocco or Trevor Hoffman, my whole life would have changed. Because I think, and what I try to encourage people when they are not sure about how to come out, but they have feelings that they want to, I share the example that I thought coming out meant I was going to be in my uniform behind a microphone with the Step and Repeat logo, and not me talking to you, one man, one friend, one brother who loved me, because I was a battler, that we went through the same process. I got through the minor leagues, all that kind of, I had such low opinion or self-esteem at that time, because I had never even had a conversation, a truthful one, maybe with one other person before my partner, Sam. Like, he was my whole outlet for the true me. And so when you talk about like the importance of safe spaces, it's not about, a player coming out as much as a player feeling love and connection, and then they can prosper. Our careers, baseball players' careers they're more intense. They're going to be shorter. The money is going to be crazy. There's a lot of considerations that need to be made about that. But if you could walk in a clubhouse, Bruce Bochy was my last manager, but Jim Riggleman wrote me a letter when I came back to baseball and said, all these years, I've been kicking myself that I couldn't be there for you. In 1995, man, I would have, and I just said, you know what, Jim, just you saying that now is so valuable and amazing to me, but I didn't have the goods to bring it to you, and it's no one else's fault. It was a different time and place, and these messages that you put out into the world, Gabe, for a myriad of reasons of support that are about people who have a different life experience than you have. You're never going to get a thank you from every one of those people, but it is so invaluable and important. And this is the message I try to convey to athletes when they want to know why we're doing, why do we have to have a night of a certain kind, or because they've never experienced the type of bias or discrimination that like people in my community have. And I haven't experienced bias and discrimination the way the trans community has, or the way women have, or lesbians, or people of color. It's all different. And it's so important for me to be an ally and a part of a family in a bigger conversation. For Roscoe's life experience, his is different than mine, but I can empathize with it because I know where the seed starts, and it doesn't mean it's the same or it was worse or better, but that's how I think connections get made. And I missed that opportunity with the baseball world.
I appreciate that. There's a couple of things that I want to come back to, but since you mentioned Roscoe's experience, and you're taking a sip of water for good reason. You're rocking and rolling there for a minute. I'd love to hear about your experiences, Roscoe. And in particular, I'm not sure if I've ever really asked you about high school sports or entry into sports. So I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah. I grew up playing sports. I mean, my mom put me in baseball when I was 5, and I fell in love with it. Then I played basketball and football through high school, and baseball as well through high school, and did not continue in college because it wasn't good enough. But I've loved sports my entire life, so that's part of my life. Coming out was a gradual and long and extended process. You have to first understand it for yourself, and some people pick up on it right away, and others it takes a little bit of a long time. So you have to kind of understand it for yourself before you can really try to explain it to other people, right? So it was a long and extended process, and like Billy came out really later in life, and it's just a different experience. And so I was already sort of in my first professional career. It wasn't in baseball, but it was in the corporate world, and I was living in a state where there were no LGBTQ plus protections at all. So I could lose my job at any time. For that reason, I could lose my apartment, be evicted from my apartment at any time. I could be kicked out of a restaurant or some type of place of business for that specific reason without anything. And so you move around the world with this constant state of fear that you're going to have to deal with something, or you're, going to run into somebody who's going to have a problem with it at work, and it's going to tear up your career. And that constant state of fear and defensive,ness and looking over your shoulder, it sort of handcuffs you to the point where you don't even trust your closest friends who are your closest friends. Sometimes you're a little nervous about that. It's a constant state of like repression and oppression, and it often leads people in the community to dangerous, self-destructive behaviors just to cope. And we know the numbers of teen suicides and young people's suicides who are queer, who can't get over the hump of coming out because they can't see past that. It was very similar to me. I could not see past what life would be like after that for a very, very long time. And so, I engaged in, overusing alcohol for quite a long time to cope with it. And, it robs you of quite a bit of your life. It robs your company of incredible talent. It robs society of being the best society that we can be. And if there was more of an environment that we're seeing today with young people where it's more understood and accepted, and kids have an environment where they can grow up and understand that there are, multiple expressions of gender, multiple expressions of orientation, and can come out at a very young age, and the world is sort of crafted around who they are. It would have been a much different place, I think, for myself. And Billy alludes to a lot of that in his career, right? It would have been a different place. And so that's, what it was like for me. It is much different now. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's what it was like for me.
Cool. I guess this question is for both of you guys, and it stems from, I have two sons. Neither of them were baseball players. They both played baseball at a very early age, but they both played football. And my younger son is actually headed to the University of British Columbia to continue his football career and his education. My older son, Chase, is now done with football. But you guys both mentioned that you played high school football. And I'm actually curious if, what your mindset was like at that time. And Billy, I know you had mentioned that it wasn't until much later in life that you sort of, I don't know if this is the right way to think about this, but where you recognized or were willing to discuss, but I'm curious about the thoughts that you had as high school football players, and if any of these thoughts ever popped up in your mind about how you'd be accepted as football players. As
a gay person inside by your football teammates?
Yeah, so I think of baseball as one culture and football as another. Now, I think there's a ton of similarities between the two cultures, but I would say there is not a more, I guess the violence of the sport of football, I think could bring up a lot of uncomfortable feelings for any man, but in particular, potentially for gay men. And I'm curious if that's accurate or if I'm wildly off there.
Well, I mean, when I was playing football, it's interesting. My high school football coach was very religious, and I thought he walked on water. He was one of those coaches that has like a major impact, like all of us have, when we're young. And I just remember, I think that's, at least for me, kept me from processing. And I look back now and I understand absolutely where I was suppressing and I think I used to dive into, the brick wall and Wrigley and, like I would do anything to prove my teammates that I was tough. Right. And I don't know if that, to the detriment, I was hurt all the time, even though and then I wouldn't tell anybody about it. And that's why I hit 230, it's because, it was like, but I wanted to prove all the time, over and over. And I do agree the culture is different. I'm very good friends with the Saratuolo, who played in the NFL as a nose guard for the Green Bay Packers and Atlanta Falcons, played in the Super Bowl, started in the Super Bowl. He came out in 2002, a year after he stopped playing. And he said that he felt if he would have told anybody, guys would have gone after his knee. Like we don't have that here. You know what I mean? Like somebody, and there is power in one or two of the alpha guys on whatever club that really dictate, that atmosphere. And I think one of the reasons why we are not seeing athletes come out while they're active is self-preservation, and the, players move around a lot more. And, high school football, how easy it is for the younger guys to follow, the seniors or I just think that high school might be the hardest level of all for kids to come forward in that sports environment because of being bullied, and how dangerous that could be. It's like the dangers of hazing at that level. when they're unsupervised, and they're kind of grown men, but they're still kids at the same time, and how impressionable someone who might be like I was, them wanting to please their teammates and hold on to that. So it's very interesting, and I do think the composition, the scale of baseball, the NBA, NFL are three different conversations when it comes to acceptance. One or two. If LeBron James is good with somebody, he's going to be fine on the Lakers. You know what I mean? Or Steph Curry, because they are so influential. But again, as you said, Gabe, baseball teams are made up of there's a lot of players there that people don't know, and they come and go, and the amount of transactions that happen, it takes time for people to get to know each other. And I think that all sort of leads into why we have not seen more acceptance or signs of acceptance that would allow a player to come out. Now, culturally, I have never been prouder of baseball in the messaging that we have compared to when I came back in 2014. And I think that that has a lot to do with, that most players are comfortable and used to the day-to-day interaction. Even though there's not a lot of Roscoe's and me running around MLB, the visibility that we have, it's not like a surprise like it would have been in the 90s.
Yeah, I definitely think that we're making progress, and maybe I'll direct this one to Roscoe. But how can we in professional sports improve the environments for members of the LGBTQ plus community, especially given how much work you're doing on that right now, Roscoe?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up, sort of touched on a little bit of culture, Billy. That really is part of it. And I just go back to what you said earlier, Billy. When I think about sports in high school, I was really focused on being the best athlete I could be and making good grades so I can get into a good school. And that's really where a lot of my focus was. But in the background, and honestly in the foreground, were all of these sort of microaggressions and very blatant messages that, anyone who is a part of the queer community is not welcome here. And we are going to demonstrate that in several different ways. And so even if it were the case where I would have first understood and known for myself then, and second of all, would have had support in some of my teammates, there wasn't a bigger environment that would have supported, any type of opportunity to to understand yourself and then be yourself, right? And I think that sort of translates all the way up probably into professional sports as well. We have to talk and have these conversations more. We have to help colleagues understand and demystify what it's like to be a member of the LGBTQ community, because there's all kinds of TV and entertainment news out there spreading, embellishing or spreading disinformation that can be scary to people who might not understand. We have to ensure that we are represented across the organization in every aspect of the organization, whether that's in decision-making rooms or clubhouse, marketing or sales, baseball or business. I think teams are doing a better job using their resources to show support for their LGBTQ fan base and community. And I think that teams need to continue to do a good job in that and actually go out in the community. Cap, we've talked about this before, I think, and it really is about, whenever you're talking about any underrepresented community, it's about creating meaningful relationships, right? So that you understand that. And teams have to be intentional about doing that in the community and, within their own front offices. And then we start to sort of change the culture and make it more inviting, make it a little bit more warm and understanding and accepting, so that if there are queer people who are not out, whether they're in the front office or on the field or in the clubhouse, they at least can see that there is an environment there that would be supportive to them. And that's, I think the other obvious thing to do, we talk about this in a lot of other areas too, is hiring, right? We have to hire more LGBTQ folks. And the interesting thing about that is when you talk about sort of experiences and diversity of thought and diversity and things like that, many of us, like Billy and I have explained, have gone through quite a bit of adversity, right? We have incredibly unique life experiences that have built character, resilience, strength, grit, mental toughness, a unique sense of perception of the world. We're incredibly observant because we're often having to protect ourselves. And it gives us also this sort of sense of empathy. Billy described it a little bit earlier. You got that sense from what he was talking about, the empathy that he had for people in the clubhouse who might not feel comfortable coming out. There's a high level of like social perception and social intelligence, and that provides a lot of advantages in any aspect of a club. And in any team where you're looking to have even just a slight advantage over other teams, those are some of the type of characteristics you're looking for when you're hiring people. And so I think there really is an opportunity for teams to, really get to know the community, connect with the community, and be able to work with the community to bring some of those incredible traits and attributes to any club, to be honest with you.
I really tried to encourage the LGBTQ plus communities in areas around where our teams play to be an education partner for our clubs in a way that sort of brings that conversation to the middle and introduce, and when, like Roscoe said, building strong relationships that allow clubs to make versed decisions when it comes to what's going on in the world and understand local, state level legislation. And to me, it allows a sense of not only relationship to be built, but also a sense of confidence about how the club wants to shape that community outreach in the future, whether it's with philanthropic support or issues that are important to someone in the front office, or successful events that are marketed, through the season. But I find that a lot of times where people, at least they see one team doing something very grand and broad, and then they expect that to happen right away. And I try to tell them that that night or that action, that initiative activation was the process or the result of 3 or 4 or 5 years of work together. And it allows, to grow a message that's organic and real to the people in and around, the community where the team plays.
I wanted to share, I know Rick Welts we were hoping that he'd be able to join us. And I know the previous time he would have been able to make, but just wanted to share a quote that stood out to me. He said, "We can't make the decision for them. It's the most personal, difficult decision they'll probably ever make. What we can do is make sure we create the work atmosphere where they know their job is not in jeopardy." And it made me think about Roscoe and how we kind of opened this discussion, some of the fear around rising in the ranks of a job, or not being able to maintain professional stature. And I'm just wondering and this is actually me thinking out into our clubhouse. I'm in our in the office now, but our clubhouse is right out in that area. And how do we create that space so these athletes do know that their job is not in jeopardy and they can be whoever they want to be? And we're going to care for them. And Billy, to your point earlier, we're going to show them love.
Well, I think it has to start at the top, where 100% support of that culture or that shift with ownership and then the front office. It's interesting. If a player wants to come out right now, they will be called a gay baseball player, not a baseball player that just happens to be gay. And I will forever have the word gay in front of my whatever history or legacy I leave behind this world. And that is not the case for straight athletes. So it's not the case, and maybe, we have a lot of work to do to change that. But I think the way that you're going about it, Cap, with the idea, you're fearless with your messaging. You were fearless with your support for Black Lives Matter last summer. That was not always the case for a major league manager. Maybe it was never the case for a major league manager until last year. You did not, at least from my vantage point, and I like to see everything that's going on in this type of space around baseball because I love to support the positive. You were not afraid of who might be twisted out of shape by you supporting a group of people that have been the target of bias and discrimination and systemic racism their entire lives, from one degree to another. None of us know, and it's people would expect Roscoe to support that message because he's an African-American man. But for someone who's not, to put themselves out there and pull themselves into a conversation that's broader, it's the same thing that has to happen for people in the LGBTQ community. We can't wait for one player to come out and have the whole conversation rest on their shoulders. It's hard enough to play in the big leagues as it is, right? You see it every day. The game is getting better and better, and the athletes, there's so much to consider. So it's the environment around, the Giants need to elevate Roscoe's place in the company and be proud of his diversity that he brings to that collective group. He's a feather in their cap. And what is interesting is that we have all these different conversations about racial equity, gender equity in the professional sports workplace, but we don't hear the same conversation about going out and finding that LGBTQ candidate the same way we do that, we're trying to make the numbers better represent society, which is not to say that we shouldn't do that. It's just interesting where there might be a little comfort level with LGBTQ conversation in the sports world, as opposed to front and center. The DEI conversation in pro sports now is at the front of the line. And that is because clubs know that they have to be participating. Now, you can't put your head in the sand and wait for someone else to do it. Those days are over. And so the responsibility changes, and how we message via social media, or what employees represent us in signature moments on the field or in the media or at league meetings. These are simple considerations that just show that there is a broader mindset, and there are more voices that have a diverse experience at the table representing the club.
I think that's really well said, Billy. I would add to that, absolutely, Cap. There's no doubt that not only you not having fear to discuss issues of discrimination, but actually celebrating and welcoming the opportunity to do so, and using any opportunity or negative story to try to find the positive and create an educational moment in that. Cap, it's critical that you work with other managers to do so, and other coaches to do so on their own platforms. That would be huge. Of course, owners and presidents and leaders in organizations as well. All of that is incredibly important. But I will add to that intersectionality is a very real thing. You are, some people are not just LGBTQ plus. They're lesbian and Latinx. They are Asian, Pacific Islander, and gay. They are Black and trans. And whenever we highlight those cultures, whether it's a Cultural History Month, a special on TV, a special on sports radio, we need to include stories of LGBTQ plus folks as well who have contributed to those communities just as much. And those stories are missing. So it isn't just about having this isolated moment where you're focusing on the queer community, which that's fantastic, great, needed. Pride Month is really, really important. But when you talk about race in America in a series, a segment, part of the series needs to talk about queer contributions to that as well. And so there are a lot more opportunities out there to talk about the LGBT community, share stories of celebration and contribution without it just being a Pride Month. It can be part of a broader conversation on many, many other things as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Roscoe. Figured this be a perfect time to bring Christina in. Christina, we've all kind of introduced ourselves and said hello, but would you mind doing the same?
Absolutely. Like, do you want like a full like background, or like I am Christina Karhl, or how do you want me to frame it?
I think it would be a great start to hear about what you're doing at the Chronicle, and then kind of hear about how, the introduction to the San Francisco community has been for you.
Well, my name is Christina Kahrl, and I'm the news sports editor at the San Francisco Chronicle after spending a decade with ESPN, and before that, as one of the co-founders of Baseball Prospectus, where we launched careers of people you probably have heard of, like Nate Silver, but not to mention a bunch of other analysts, and in fact, I think right now 2 major league general managers. So I've had an interesting career to get to this point. But for me, the opportunity of coming to the Bay Area and working with a remarkably talented group of writers and covering not just the teams, but I think the life of people within sports in the Bay Area was just an opportunity I could not resist when it came up. So. But it does come in the context of my being, I was both the first person to come out as trans while working in sports back in 2002, 2003, and to get to the point of actually getting to be the boss of an entire sports department in a major daily newspaper is also unprecedented at this point. So it's kind of nice aspirationally for me to be able to see progress in my own career. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that in working in sports, I'm given the power and the privilege of talking about something that people like and people want to talk about and engage with. And so on a positive level, I'm not talking about being trans. I might be visibly trans, but I'm not, and I'm not ashamed of being out or anything like that. But I'm here to talk about subjects that people want to talk about. We want to talk about baseball. Let's talk about baseball. That's a pretty popular topic. I want to talk about what's going on with the Niners. Want to talk about what's going on with the Warriors. Those are subjects that engage people and let us look at what interests us collectively, that it ends up being a conversation where we're all participating. And even though we might be different and coming from different backgrounds, that we can instead focus on what engages us equally and what captures, and basically looking at people and looking beyond their differences and looking at what we have in common. And so that's one of the reasons why I love working in sports. And what I find particularly rewarding is that as much as my career has been relatively unprecedented, a lot of it went back to my approach to it, which is that ultimately I just want to talk about sports. And so going into when I first went back into the locker room after I transitioned, they could have been handled in a different way as far as trans women goes in the locker room. And it's I'm not there for that. I'm there to be a sports journalist asking some of the same dumb questions that every, manager or athlete has to put up with from all the other reporters. And so I don't want to make my appearance in that space extraordinary because I have a job to do. And so by taking that approach and basically just trying to be another, bum with a recorder and a notebook and asking how bad was your day at the ball game today, basically. And my empathy goes out to the players. If I had to deal with a room full of strangers asking me how bad was my day at work while I'm pulling on my pants, that's no fun. So that's hard. Being a professional athlete is hard enough. So, for me to be in that space is a privilege. For me to help tell their stories is a privilege. It's one I take very seriously. And because I think I treat it in the same way that I would hope all journalists treat the responsibility of that job, is that engendered a lot of acceptance of me as a trans person, like working in that space, is that I've got the same priorities you do, and I want to talk about the same things you want to talk about. And so that opportunity, again, I can't overstate how wonderful it has been for me in the world of sports, because, like, again, if I go into a locker room and talk to a ball player, he may cock his eye and like say, like, who is this character? But ultimately, we're just going to be talking about like launch angle and exit velocity and spin rate, and just the same as everybody else who might be coming at it from a particularly analytical point of view. I'm going to be asking those kinds of questions. And these are things that players know about and can talk about. And they can talk about with somebody who's a little bit off the beaten track or a little different, the same as they can talk about it with everybody else. Because ultimately, the way I frame it is, trans person goes into a locker room, baseball conversation breaks out. That's all there is. So and that's great fun. But that's where the players have been great. The game has been great. But I think it's because I focused on just doing the job the same as anybody else. And when I have aspirational role models like Susan Slusser, when I came out, Susan was in my corner. And as now that she's working on the Giants beat, of course, Gabe, you get to deal with her every day. But the fact that this was a person who stood up for me, and now I'm her boss, is kind of like, it's a reminder of the privilege I have in working, not just in the game, but with the people who are in the game.
It's really cool. I gotta be honest. Like, the whole time we were talking about things that you want to talk about, and you mentioned the Warriors and the Niners. Like, oh no, are we going to talk about this Dodgers series that we just had? And you didn't mention the Giants. And like, whew, thank goodness.
Cap, I want to just say, Christina, it's so great to see you. We've known each other forever. But I had the same philosophy when you are leading a conversation with what you have in common. It breaks down the barriers, as opposed to leading with why you need to, allow me in your space or whatever it is. They're just, and baseball moves, at the pace that it wants to. But that's why Christina's been so successful. And it would have been easy for that not to have happened. But it's a deeper understanding of Commissioner Manfred told me, one time he just said, don't ever forget that you were a player. You know what I mean? Like, and all of a sudden I was like, exactly. You know what I mean? And so, and I love Christina and I could talk baseball for 24 hours straight when we, sit down. And that's the same attitude I try to take towards the players, is that what we have in common here is baseball. And now we're going to show why baseball's strong and is growing outward and embracing people with a wider hug and more, acceptance.
I think the other thing is that, I think of it as, I have a lot of conversations with people who might be other firsts, as it were, and about our obligation to the future. Like talking to Claire Smith about being the first woman working a regular baseball beat. Claire is another one of my role models, and who's someone who's been in my corner, and like talking to her about being the first woman who's regularly in the locker room, and also being, a woman of color, and her sense of obligation to the future, to everyone like her, to other women on the beat. I had this conversation with Thomas Harding, who's been on the Rockies beat forever, about the sense of responsibility that I have to have for not just my own career, but for anybody who follows in my footsteps, that I need to make sure that not only am I trying to execute a good story, but I've taken it as I'm probably the first trans person a lot of people meet. And so I feel an obligation that I need to make sure that for that person, they, however they respond in that moment, that it's going to be better for them, the second trans person that they meet, that they won't necessarily get weirded out about it, and that they've or if they do have questions, there's a respectful way to handle them, but that, that's not what I'm there for. I'm there to do a job. And in the same way, if they respect that about me, in the same way that I hopefully respect them as far as the job they have to do as a professional athlete or as a manager or a coach or scout, you name it. It's like that we're operating on the same level and focusing on what we can talk about instead of what might derail an entire conversation.
So this might come off as like a general question. I don't mean it to be like overly general, but I'd like to discuss how professional sports can support the trans community. And I don't mean just journalists. I mean, just generally speaking. So I don't know if you have any specific thoughts about that or things on your mind.
I think the particularly tough thing is particularly like when you're talking about the violence that's directed against trans people, particularly trans women of color. There was a year in Washington where like 6 different trans women were murdered. I knew 2 of them, and that was just in one 12-month period. And so, that got to the point that my boss, called me into his office and said, I had no idea, I'm just starting to look at the headlines, and I had no idea. Do you feel you're in danger? And I'm like, well, probably not. For me, I mean, I live with a life of pretty extraordinary relative privilege. I mean, again, I've got a great white collar job, and I don't feel that, but that's my privilege. The number of trans women in the world who are dealing with underemployment, and so they don't have, whether they've been thrown out by their families because they don't accept them as youths, whether they're dealing with homelessness, and insecurity about where they're, employment. All of that ends up adding up to putting a lot of trans people at a lot of personal danger and personal risk. And so the particularly unprecedented wave of violence, I'd say, we're seeing against trans people across the country. I think the murder rate numbers are at all-time highs this year, and just in the first couple, we're not even 5 full months out in. You can blame some of that on my fellow journalists and the way in which they do handle stories about trans people. But I think more generally, I think it's coming from a place of a lack of knowledge. And so I would encourage people both to, approach the subject with empathy and with an understanding that trans people are generally speaking, I am not the person you should be thinking about when you think about trans people. You should be thinking about the people who are vulnerable and what they need. And a lot of that is going to come from, the way in which you can support trans kids and kids dealing with coming out, and whether or not they're, again, we're dealing with a very difficult situation with local legislation all over the map, as far as some states are passing laws that deliberately target trans kids for not getting health care, not being able to participate in sports, getting singled out. That's not really the country I thought I grew up in. And so that's a little difficult to deal with, as far as I would say you'd want to help kids have childhoods, normal child, and can get to do the same things that all kids can take for granted. And so as much as I understand that it's a thorny public policy issue, it's something where people should be framing it in terms of, these are kids, they just want to play with their they're within their own, cohort, their own age group. If you're talking about youth soccer, if you're talking about PE, we've seen so many positive public policy outcomes. This is not a new phenomenon of trans kids existing in the first place. LA Unified School District, one of the biggest school districts in the entire country, has had trans inclusion in K through 12 sports for 13 years. And so you're talking about a school district that's graduated over almost 1 million kids in that time. You have not seen a huge rash of trans girls dominating school sports. And, so we're in this weird kind of space where, as much as this might be a new subject for most people, we haven't done a very good job. And again, I'd say this is the media's fault, and I'm in the media, so I got to share a collective responsibility for that. But we don't celebrate our public policy successes that, like kids go to school, play sports, no story, no front page story, no drama there. It's just like kids went to PE and nothing bad happened. The fact that we don't celebrate that and notice that, like all of these things that are in the headlines and get scaremongered about trans kids, they're not happening where people have already made informed choices on this subject. And so that's where I think if we do a better job, and certainly I kind of hope that maybe the Chronicle will be one of those papers leading the charge there, but if we do a better job of talking about how trans kids are just kids and they just want the same things as other kids, and the way you include them, that might start the entire conversation about trans people off in a better place and help people understand that, like if you can embrace and accept trans kids for who they are, maybe that helps us get around the issues of like home insecurity and violence and survival crime and all of the other things that are really endemic issues right now.
I think, Cap, what my example of reaching out to the LGBTQ community that are near or in the communities where we play, them providing an education or information that, as you can see, it's a very broad and complex conversation when you talk about how to be more supportive of the trans community. There's many factors going on. I think the most direct way an organization or a sports organization could be supportive is to understand state legislation and come out against laws that take away the civil rights of the LGBTQ plus community. That is, they use the trans community like they used marriage equality to polarize conservative voters and mix it with religion. And it's, as Christina is saying, at the end of the day, it mostly harms young kids and parents' rights to be supportive of their children in a way that is their true self. And where baseball begins and ends, working from the office of the commissioner, a lot of these conversations are very complicated because our job is to make baseball, right? And to provide entertainment. But the San Francisco Giants, as an example, are massive influencers of the people of the Bay Area. What they say, what they do matters. And that can be a very constructive activation for just using their voice on inclusion or an accepting message. Share their values instead of don't say anything. And the perception might be that they agree with a law that might take the rights away from part of our community, for all of our community.
A really valuable message for me to be able to take away and just think about how influential our players are in particular. And a lot of them believe genuinely and authentically that a more inclusive clubhouse is better for our sport, and just figuring out ways to help them say it with conviction, I think is something that I'll take away from this conversation. So I know that everybody has deadlines here and things to get to, and we covered a lot. Is there anything that you guys feel is unsaid at this point that probably needs to come up in this discussion in the last couple of minutes that we have?
I appreciate the opportunity to hear Roscoe's message, and I'm glad Christina was able to jump on. But Cap, mostly, you are a huge influencer in our sport, and just the way that you even frame it as a father, trying to think about, the world that your sons are going to live in, and how important that messaging and that example is. These conversations they're meaningful, and it was a privilege to be a part of today. I appreciate it very much.
I appreciate your time as well. And interesting that you brought up the last thing I'll say about my sons. I actually think my sons and their peers are much better at creating inclusive environments than we are in professional sports. And so I think having that perspective and being able to take cues from them, surprisingly, has been really helpful. And so we'll continue to just kind of listen and try to take the messages that you guys are sharing, that my sons are sharing, and that they're their peers are sharing and try to spread that in our sport. Roscoe, thank you. Billy, thank you. Christina, thank you. And look forward to our next discussion. I hope we do it again soon.